Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding. You are once again listening to PreserveCast. Today, we are really excited to be sitting down with Pamela McColl. We're going to be talking with her about some of her more recent publications, including her more recent endeavor, The Wondrous Mrs. Claus, a literary and pictorial review of the Christmas character. Longtime listeners of PreserveCast know that we've covered the history of Santa Claus, and so I thought it was only appropriate that we sit down with a historian of Mrs. Claus and understand how the story expanded and unfolded from there, and how that story is preserved in the hearts and minds of people all over the world. But before we get there, just a quick reminder for listeners of PreserveCast, it really does help if you click the like, the subscribe, give us a rating on whatever you're listening to us on. I know some of you listen to us on iTunes, whether it be there or Amazon Prime or over on Spotify. If you can just give us a review, it helps get us out there and lets other people know about PreserveCast. So please do that. And if you're new to PreserveCast, know that we have over 350 episodes in the backlog where you can go and dig into all the different stories and topics we have covered over these many years. But today we're sitting down with Pamela McColl, who is an award-winning author, a publisher, a lecturer. She has covered Christmas in many different interesting ways, as well as a host of other topics. But for today's episode, we're going to be talking again about The Wondrous Mrs. Claus, this most recent endeavor. But before we get there, we love to get to know the people that we're talking to. So Pamela, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? And what led you to get involved in sort of writing about history, and in particular, this aspect of American and world history?
Well, I am a Canadian, and I grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I have an undergraduate degree in Canadian American history, so I've always been fascinated in our relationship. And I also have a postgraduate degree in cultural history, so I studied theater and art in that endeavor. And I've just always loved history. I've loved reading about the great people who have gone before us and the lessons they can teach all of us.
And so let me follow up on that. As a kid growing up, were you going to a lot of historic sites? Was there a favorite place? Was it sort of part of the family experience? What was the sort of the impetus for that? What led you to that line of study?
Well, I think I'm very fortunate in that I have a family history that I find very interesting, and that my parents, particularly my father, was able to, dig deep into. So I can trace my roots back into the 1600s. And I have a chronology of my family, a genealogy that goes back. We're Scottish ancestry and Americans. So I can trace my family back on all 4 sides. And I think that always intrigued me, the romance of it all. I think just knowing that you come from, where you come from has always been really interesting. And my brother lives in Scotland. I've been there multiple times, probably 12, 20 times maybe. And the history there, of course, is so rich and vibrant. But I also, take great pride in my American connections through Boston, and also through my Irish McGuinness side of my mother's mother. So I think it's really that. It's this family connection that really excites me, and reaching back into the era of Mary Queen of Scots. So it's just been really fun, and I think that probably ignited my interest. But I also love literature and art, and so when you come at literature and art, cultural history, you want to learn about the people that created these great masterpieces. And so I've always loved biographies, and that's probably, I read more biographies than anything else. And I just finished reading Washington Irving's biography of George Washington, 5 volume set, which I own the first edition of. So that was really fun. After going to Mount Vernon, I kind of got inspired to do that. So no, just a love of history. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, Washington Irving plays heavily into the story of Santa Claus and sort of our understanding of sort of this modern Santa Claus. So it makes perfect sense. I'm curious about first experiences in the field. So you study, and then do you become a writer? Do you become a lecturer? What's the path to kind of writing the books that you've been so successful at writing recently?
Well, I became a publisher in 1995, and I started doing a history of Whistler, the ski resort community in British Columbia. I did the first history of Whistler, a fun sort of little book. And that kind of got me going into the world of publishing. And I didn't really focus on history so much. I think my undergraduate degree and my graduate work in history was really for my own personal satisfaction and endeavors, not so much my profession. I ended up working in the arts for a long time, a little bit of film, a little bit quite a bit in art consulting, buying and selling art for governments and hospitals and corporations. I did that for about 25 years, actually. But it was publishing in 1995. And then I really, I guess, hit my stride in 2012, which, we can talk about. And it just happened upon this great project of taking the smoking pipe away from Santa and becoming the person known as getting Santa Claus to quit smoking after almost 200 years of puffing away. And it was really my edition of 'Twas the Night Before Christmas without the smoking Santa that afforded me an international platform to talk about tobacco prevention, but also 'Twas the Night Before Christmas in a way I never imagined.
Yeah, how did that come about?
I was working as a volunteer. I work in drug prevention as a not-for-profit, and I was working on smoke-free movies with Stanton Glantz out of the University of Southern California. We were trying to get disclaimers on films that said this film had smoking. And I was thinking, well, what else can I do? Because I'm a publisher, and I thought, well, maybe I can do, a children's book, or I don't know. I was just really open to an idea. And I went to the library and I was going through all the children's literature, and I found Three Little Bears smoking and, over Goldilocks. And I found Leprechaun smoking and rabbits and then I bumped into Santa and I went, Eureka. The last person in the world who should be depicting smoking and modeling smoking to children is Santa. So I simply took the lines out, I edited it, and I ended up doing this production. I went, full bore on it, spending a lot of money, had great designers and illustrators and publicity and everything else. And it just hit a chord because it was talked about all over the world that I'd done this thing. It was talked about in China, in India, Australia, all over America. NBC Nightly News, Stephen Colbert, The View, everybody found it fascinating that I had chosen to make a smoke-free Santa. But it afforded me, as I said, this enormous platform. And I ended up at the United Nations in Vienna and New York speaking about tobacco prevention. So I also have to thank the American Library Association because they came at me really hard through NPR of Los Angeles and other venues, other media outlets, disclaiming what I'd done, calling it an act of literary vandalism and accusing me of being disturbing and disgusting or something. And I had a lawyer from Cincinnati call me up and say, I heard that, and I'm going to take them on, and they're going to be, issuing a retraction because that was not appropriate. What you're doing is tobacco prevention, and it's not censorship, it's an edit. And so he did, and sure enough, that happened. So anyway, it was all a very interesting journey. And I became, I guess, the lead on the bicentennial in 2023 on 'Twas the Night Before Christmas in America. And I have a signed letter from Joe Biden on my desk thanking me for everything I did. So,
and that's quite the journey. And I'm sure people are curious. Has Santa kicked the habit permanently? Do you think he's off?
Yes. Well, I've been in the Santa Claus community now. There's Santa Clauses all over America, as you know, doing great things all year long for children. And I've met probably 3,000 of them. And they always just put their fingers over or skip that part or turn the page or. So I think it's interesting that Nordstrom's, the great department store, doesn't allow a copy with Smoking Santa in their store. So kind of funny.
Interesting. Yeah,
It
yeah.
is.
So obviously this is like this kind of introduction. You didn't start off as a Santa historian. It kind of just, moved in that direction. You had the opportunity to put that 200th anniversary volume together, and sort of all this excitement around the whether or not Santa will have the pipe or not, and that then leads into the Wondrous Mrs. Claus. So give us a little background on. I mean, it kind of makes sense why you would reach out into the family here, but where does the story of Mrs. Claus get mentioned? We have previously covered, and we could even go back maybe and let you give the crib notes of how we get to the modern day understanding of Santa and Washington Irving and all these different people, the role that they play in that. But so maybe give us that, and then where does Mrs. Claus come into the picture?
Well, I think it's very important that people remember Washington Irving, especially this celebratory year with the 250th. I think that Washington Irving mentions in Knickerbocker History of the World, St. Nicholas 25 times, including flying over the skies of Manhattan in a wagon. So we do credit Washington Irving with bringing St. Nicholas into this realm of the mystical and magical. We then have James Fenimore Cooper in The Pioneers in 1821 write about driving home on a sleigh, the judge, to be home in time on Christmas Eve for Santa Claus. It's the first time ever in any language that we see the word Santa Claus. So it's James Fenimore Cooper. That book was released in 1822. 1823, Clement Clark Moore writes Twas the Night Before Christmas. He calls him Saint Nick. He's not Santa Claus yet, but he's an elf, hugely important. He's taken out of the world of Saint Nicholas into the world of the magical beings of elves. Very, very important. And so Mrs. Claus, so what happens to her is she comes along in 1849 in Philadelphia. It's the first time we ever hear in English literature of Santa Claus having a wife. It's in a legend, Christmas legend, and it's not that she's mentioned as Mrs. Claus, but as Santa's wife. Then in 1851, I think we have to give credit to Connecticut, because in the Yale Literary Review of 1851, she is called Mrs. Santa Claus for the first time ever. And it's a very short little description of her, but it is the first time it appears. The next time she appears is 1854. This is the most fascinating for me. What I just came from speaking at the Munson Museum in Utica, New York. She arrives for the first time in the world on the stage in a theatrical production at the New York Lunatic Asylum in 1854. Now, the New York Lunatic Asylum had, under the auspices of Dr. Brigham, this concept that people who had mental illness would benefit greatly from the arts. So theater, painting, gardening, everything, all social, that they would be treated with great kindness. No one was, chained. I mean, they were treated very, very differently. Dr. Brigham, again, this is the year 250. I think it's really important to recognize major Americans this year. And Dr. Brigham should be in the list of, major Americans for contributing to society. He was the one who started the American Journal of the Psychiatric Journal. He also started the association. He also completely radicalized, revolutionized mental health by taking away the stigma and saying, no, these people are in need of compassion, kindness, the arts. They can recover, but we need to treat them properly. And that was groundbreaking, right? Yes, he was influenced out of France and England, but he did it in America in a very big way. So Mrs. Claus arrives there thanks to him, because he was the one who said that the patients could write the play, they could perform in the play, and indeed they do. And that's where Mrs. Claus shows up, which I found. I researched it as a history student. I researched that the old Main, it's called, the building's still there in Utica. It's all gated up and boarded up. But it was a massive structure, would help many, many people. So a man wrote a book about it, actually. I met him when I was there, and we did a tour together. It was all very, very, very fascinating. So that's where she shows up. And then the first professional Mrs. Claus shows up in Chicago, sort of turn of the century. And with Georgine Faulkner, who ends up going to the First World War and performing for the troops. So that's kind of a quick little rundown of how she shows up in the world. And she's American. I credit her for being from Connecticut because of the Yale Literary Review citing. And I also think it's important that Santa Claus is from Manhattan, very much, and New York was Fenimore Cooper, but Mrs. Claus is from Connecticut, and she arrives 25 years after Santa, so not that long, right?
That's fascinating little like quick snippet, and obviously you go into great detail in the book about this. And there's a preservation story in there that you just mentioned, in that like the place where she is sort of first debuted on the stage, the sort of the theatrical version of her. I did not know that piece of the story. What a fascinating piece of American sort of medical and mental health history, but a site that probably deserves some preservation unto its own, because it's such an important place.
A national treasure. It truly is. And there's Amanda did a documentary. It's on Apple. You can pay for it. I think it's $1 or $2 to watch it on the Old Main. They go inside the building. It's phenomenal. But I just wanted to say that when I was working on "'Twas the Night: The Art and History of the Classic Christmas Poem," my book that came out in 23 that won the Benjamin Franklin History Award, the Silver Award, I afforded myself 10 or 12 years to work on that book. And because I work for myself, I was able to go down all these paths. I read everything that Washington Irving wrote. When I studied his whole relationship with Sir Walter Scott and Dickens. I read everything that Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote. Like, I went to all their museums. I went to Sunnyside, and I sat in Tarrytown and so experienced, the life and world of Washington Irving. So you can see, when you're a historian, you have an interest in history. These things take on this richness, and when you afford yourself the luxury of time to get to know these people, you find things out and you make connections and you discover things. And actually, in writing that book, "'Twas the Night," I found some really interesting things in the Smithsonian regarding George Washington and the Clement Clark Moore family that I shared with Mount Vernon. And that's the great fun, right? When you're a historian writing, is that you can find things and discover things. I'll just quickly add, too, the other great big piece of being a historian writing is that you can correct mistakes that have been made, which, when you're afforded that ability to do it, is really rewarding. And I was able to correct one major mistake that had been written about Clement Clark Moore, the fact that he owned slaves, which he indeed did not. He's the wrong generation. His father did, but not he. And there's a very famous book called The Battle for Christmas, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and that's where the mistake was made. And I was able to, with the help of a journalist out of Bloomberg, to create a file and the evidence to discredit that claim. So that was very, very rewarding for me, just because I think it's very important that we get it right, and keep people's reputations intact when we can.
Right. Yeah, that's a big change. So, the book that you wrote, Wondrous Mrs. Claus, the one we're talking about, and we've written several, but this one that we're sort of zeroing in on is both a literary and pictorial review. So, how has her character changed over the years? What did you see? And does she have a set image? And is that still reflected today? Do we see her as much today? Like, how does it change over time?
Well, it's fascinating to look at that because she changes so many times. It's as though people who wrote about her starting in the 1860s onwards, 1870s, 1880s, they didn't read what anybody else had ever written about her because they make it all up every time they go. They have a new name. She's a blonde, redhead, brunette. She's old. She's young. She's every shape. She's wearing all kinds of different clothing. It's just totally fascinating, right? The part that gets really interesting is when she gets involved in the suffrage movement and her position and her relationship with Santa. I mean, there's some stories like Catherine Lee Bates, who writes Goody, 1888. She has a loving relationship with Santa, but she wants to have more fun and she wants to be part of the sleigh ride. And it's all very jolly and nice. There's a couple little digs at Santa, but nothing too brutal. There's other stories, written in the 1870s that came before that, I mean, they're really feisty. She calls him a snapping turtle, and And there's some real anger and there's some real like, I want my turn. I want my accolades. I want to be given credit. Very much part of, I want the vote. So,
Right, right, right.
you know, so it's no, it's really fascinating. But I think although I was able to find and read and republish many of the early stories, which I think have been buried for a very long time. There is an essence of her that always comes through. There's always the virtues, the values of Saint Nicholas, of Santa Claus, this generosity, benevolence, charity, kindness. It's all always there because that's really the essence of who this is, right? The very best of us.
That's interesting. And do you think that I mean, in modern day depictions, do we see her as much? Has she ebbed and flowed in terms of the appearance of her? Is she as present today as she was, say, 50, 60, or 100 years ago?
I think she was very prevalent in the 1870s to the 1880s. I found lots of stories about her. And I think something happened to her when she was written about in a kindergarten journal that we don't really need Mrs. Claus. It sort of takes away from the mythology of Santa or the magicalness of Santa to lineate him more, to give him more definition like that. Um, I don't know if what caused her to decline, but she did for a little bit there. I think that what happened too was when you have the advance of television in the 1960s, she starts to reappear because you have, Rudolph, there she is. Even in Charlie Brown, Sally writes a letter to her saying, "Hi, Mrs. Claus," kind of thing. So she appears in television in a big way for my generation. I'm 67. So I think it's really the films too that started up with her, like Angela Lansbury in 1997. Each generation seems to have their own sort of Mrs. Claus, and it's interesting that now we have these mini commercials from places like Boots and Marks and Spencers that are widely seen, and their portrayal of Mrs. Claus is again very different, right? She's very different. She's flying around in a helicopter, running beautiful cars. Mercedes-Benz did one. She's different again. Um, but there's still, what's really interesting to me is when they bring this feistiness back in about, I want my fair share of the accolades. And I don't think that's really the essence of her. I think that needs to maybe be soft pedaled because I don't think she's looking for that. They're a team, and this is about generosity, but it's also about anonymous giving. And I don't think Mrs. Claus at the heart of her is looking to be thanked, nor is Santa. I think when you really get it right, you take away that, I want my fair share. I don't think that's part of these characters. I don't at all. I think it's against the whole basis of it. So, but it's like the naughty or nice thing too. I think that needs to go the way of the dustbin. Lemon Clark Moore got rid of it, and somehow it's back in our vocabulary. It needs to go away. It's got nothing to do with these characters being judgmental of children. It's it's cute maybe to some people, this naughty or nice concept, but I don't think it's really relevant to Mrs. Claus or Santa.
And I know you mentioned in there like names and how those have changed over time, and you're oftentimes just referring to her as Mrs. Claus. But have there been any like first names that they've settled on? For some reason in my head, Jessica is one of them, but I don't know if that's just one of them or if there's a bunch.
Joan's a great one because that's a story from the mid 1800s where she is marries Santa, and Queen Mab, the Queen of the Fairies, bestows upon her a bag of gold so that Santa and she can create anything they want for children in the future. She's Joan, and it's one of the more important stories because of the introduction of Queen Mab to this. I think, there's many, Anya, Mary, Carol. I mean, they go on and on.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But I was counseling some Santas about this and how they approach this, because let's say a child says, "What's your name, Mrs. Claus?" at one gig, and she says, "My name's Mary," and then they go to see another Mrs. Claus and they say the same question. She says, "Carol," and the child's going to go, "Well, who are you?" So we've come up with this thing where Santas say, or Mrs. Claus will say, only Santa calls her by her first name, right? It's a mystery.
It's a mystery. I like the mystery there.
Mystery.
And is there, I mean, since I'm sitting down with a Canadian historian, or at least a historian based in Canada, and that covers issues all over the world for that matter. But is there any difference between the sort of the Canadian understanding, the Canadian portrayal, just as we're sort of thinking about it, of the Canadian Santa Claus and Mrs. Claus versus sort of a more Americanized version? Or is it sort of just sort of timeless and nationless in the way that they're portrayed?
When Coca-Cola got involved with Santa Claus in the 1920s and then took him on a worldwide global tour and really promoted him like no one's ever promoted any character. I mean, Santa Claus is the most recognized character, the most influential character of all time. And I think that really solidified that image for a lot of people. They still continue with Santa Claus, as you know. They didn't do that with Mrs. Claus. I think the one piece that's really fascinating from a Canadian perspective is that before I found in my research, I found someone's writing about that Queen Mab had been involved in delivering presents to children in North America in the early 1800s, which means that's before it was. And so I went to a librarian and an archivist, and we looked and we looked and we tried to find this reference for a source. We couldn't find it. So I wasn't prepared to write about it until I could find it. We finally found it, and the diary of a Lady Jane Hunter was tucked in behind her husband's diary. That's why we couldn't find it. And it talks about Queen Mab delivering presents to children in the Maritimes in 1807. So here we have the Queen of the Fairies delivering presents, and I can't find that referenced in America, but I'm still looking for it. And I talked to some people in England who are, very well educated on fairy lore and fairy literature and everything else. They've never heard of it. So that was a major find, and that was really fun because Queen Mab is such a wonderful character, and Shakespeare and all kinds of other writers who've written about her. So I think I also like the connection with Mrs. Claus to the fairy world. I find that just another element of this that sort of is intriguing.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, like so much great culture coming from the Canadian Maritimes, so that's sort of a cool part of the story and part of the legend and lore of all of this. But, before we go, we love to talk to people about sort of some standing questions, and it's even better, I think, to talk to somebody who's up in Canada about America 250, because I think we've asked a lot of Americans about what they feel about this. 2026 is the real anniversary because that's the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. But, we're in this run up and obviously all of these anniversaries kind of matter and are a part of this and wrapped up in the story. And obviously, even more so, the 200th anniversary of the American Bicentennial in 1976 is still, for a lot of people, sort of the seminal moment. And their question is, will it be again? I guess, we've been asking people about what they'd like to see the preservation community do for America 250 here in the United States. But I'm curious maybe to rephrase that question, like, what does the America 250 mean for our neighbors to the north? What does this moment mean and how does it reflect on Canadian history? I mean, I guess broadly, what are people in Canada thinking about this at this moment?
Well, without getting too political, which I completely could do. I maybe because of my ancestry coming through Boston on my mother's side, I have always had a great admiration for America. But as a Canadian, I must say that we have an inferiority complex. We are like the little sister looking up to the big sister or big brother. And many of us, like myself, appreciate what America has been able to accomplish on every level. I think that Americans, I don't think, know how much you influence us, how we watch your media. I know your news upside down and backwards. I know all your politicians. I know everything going on in America because Canada, our media, it's just how we operate. Your movie stars are our movie stars. Your sports people are our sports people, and yet I don't think the Americans have the same concept of Canada. They don't have the same appreciation for our country on those levels. So I have worked in America for 20 years. I have my publishings out of Ashland, Ohio. and I speak all over the country. I'm actually speaking on the art and history of Christmas. I just gave a lecture at the Goodspeed in Connecticut on American Christmas theater history. Right. I love doing that. I think that what I would like to see is some of the most important Americans in your history acknowledged. And I think that if you can reach over into our country and share that with us, that would be terrific through different programs and things. Because people like Helen Keller, there's people like Dr. Brigham, who I mentioned, people like Washington Irving, people, so many great people who have done so much to advance, our world. And but I think of all of them, I think Santa Claus, being an American, being from New York, you don't get much better than Santa or Mrs. Claus. They really are the very best of us. And I want to make sure that they're not protected so much as applauded. I worked a lot in the last decade on advancing "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." I thought it was really important to keep this very famous poem alive and find people who would be enthusiastic about celebrating its bicentennial. I nominated Clement Clark Moore into the New York Hall of Fame. They accepted that. I got the mayor of the city of New York to declare it Clement Clark Moore Day. I got 30 Moors to come to a huge party in New York and Manhattan to celebrate the poem. And I went to the Library of Congress and helped get the White House to do more than they would have done to celebrate "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." So I really think it's an important poem. I think it needs to stay in our repertoire at Christmas because it's incredibly benevolent and kind and generous. And I also think it's really important to, as I have had to do, defend Santa Claus in the future. There are some people who think that we shouldn't have Santa Claus in schools, that Santa Claus shouldn't be in buildings, public buildings, that Santa Claus and Mrs. Claus, are of the religious realm because of the link to St. Nicholas and the word Christmas. It's always interesting to point out to people who have that point of view that the Supreme Court in 1981 ruled that Santa Claus is allowed in public buildings. He is an elf. And Justice Berger wrote a very great brief on this, saying it's an overreach to say he can't be there, but I'll even go further than that to say if he's there or she's there or a Christmas tree is there or Rudolph, you can have your manger. You can have other forms under the Establishment Clause. Take away these elements, it becomes problematic. So for anyone who says you can't have Santa Claus's picture on a school window, I would suggest you read the Supreme Court ruling because they said he could. Not only could, but should.
I like that. And it's a fascinating perspective. And I also just sort of picking out of there is this idea that Santa as an export of American culture and identity. I have not seen Santa come up in America 250 whatsoever. And I've been paying close attention to it. So that's an interesting point. A lot of Americans we talk about, and Ken Burns did a whole documentary on America's best idea being the national parks. And so maybe we need to do one on America's best export, jolly old Saint Nick.
It's a really good idea.
Yeah. Maybe that can be your next book. Before we go, what's your favorite historic place or site? What's a place you can go back to over and over again that you've just fallen in love with?
Well, I have to say Sunnyside because when I spent so much time reading Washington Irving, I went to Sunnyside. I spoke there in Tarrytown at multiple venues. But when you get to his museum and you sit down and it's all decked out with the furniture and photographs, and artificial food and everything else, and everyone's in costume, the docents, I sat down and you want to stay for dinner. You really want to meet Washington Irving. He was amazing. Dickens adored him. He was his mentor. Dickens says he carried it around in his knickerbocker around in his pocket. He mused with him more than anyone else. And if you read Washington Irving's Old Christmas, and then you read Dickens's Christmas Carol, you kind of know where he drew his inspirations from. So I would say Washington Irving has to be, and I always mention him, he and Helen Keller. I don't think I ever give a talk or Harry Beecher Stowe that I don't slip them in somewhere because they must be read and remembered because they're so terrific.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And that's like a perfect place to end the conversation because it brings us back to a historic site, to sort of this idea of preservation and preserving these stories and the places where they're enshrined. It's been an absolute pleasure to sit down and chat with you. Again, for those listening, and we'll put a link in the show notes so you can pick up a copy to Pamela McColl's latest endeavor, A Wondrous Mrs. Claus, a literary and pictorial review of the Christmas character, and all of her other works we'll link in there. 'Twas the Night, The Art and History of the Classic Christmas Poem, and more. Pamela, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much, and Merry Christmas.
Thank you for having me.
PreserveCast is recorded in Maryland and is powered by Preservation Maryland, a nonprofit organization headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland. Since 2017, the podcast has told stories from around the world about how people are documenting, caring for, and interpreting the past. If you want to support this effort, please visit preservecast.org to learn more and keep on preserving.